So I am going to be talking today about back to Black feminist blogging, but actually I've been writing a lot about TikTok lately. Like a lot of other folks, I found TikTok while I was on lockdown in 2020. And I decided really early on in that process that I would not be writing about TikTok. It was just going to be a really fun escape for me. But here we are in 2021, and what can I say? It is hard not to write about something that you spend a lot of your time doing all day. So this explains why in this year, I am still writing and giving talks about the blogosphere as well, because it was of such critical importance to me for such a big part of my life. But I think by the end of this talk, I may be able to convince you that these things are related, TikTok and the blogosphere, and that reading about the blogosphere is still extremely useful in 2021. So why the blogosphere? The beginning of my relationship with the blogosphere was in 2007 at Starcom Media Vest Group. I was hired out of undergrad as brand marketing and a buyer. That means that I spent my days doing media math, purchasing, and managing the television advertising for major brands like Nintendo. Having a first job is exciting, and Starcom was particularly invested in making sure new employees found our job exciting as a way to help us forget just how little we were being paid to do that job. There were huge corporate lunches at major restaurants downtown that were sponsored by television networks every week. Brand swag was left on our desks all the time. I remember getting my first Nintendo Wii at work. And the upfront season was filled with late nights of work, but parties all day long. But for the very few Black employees that were there, these experiences were isolating, to say the least. I found myself becoming increasingly detached at work as my coworkers continued to bond over after-hours drinks on their way to their North Side homes, while I trekked back to the South Side on the train every day after work. During my workday, though, I found solace in my cubicle with my computer in the blogosphere. It was there that I understood the popular culture references that people were making. It was there that the jokes made sense and didn't openly mock Blackness in ways that sometimes my coworkers' jokes did and my boss's jokes did. It was there that I found safe harbor. But it didn't occur to me at the time to write about this. I was starting a simultaneous master's program at DePaul at the time, and I wanted to study media, but in my mind, media was about studying television and film. I was fortunate, though, to enroll for my PhD program at UIC, which meant I got to sit in classes with people like Zizi Papakarisi and Steve Jones. And one of those classes with Steve Jones was on the history of technology. I remember that one of our first days of class, he took us for a walk. And we walked around UIC's neighborhood, and we ended up walking along train tracks. And we followed those train tracks as we discussed the significance of how telephone lines followed those same tracks through the neighborhood. We thought about this relationship between infrastructure, these lines of connection, these technologies both of transport and communication. In that class, we also played a game each week called, Can You Figure Out What Technology is Actually Dead? Where Steve challenged us to find some technology that really, truly no longer existed and was used by anyone. The point of that game, I think, was to illustrate to us not just that people are really good at holding on to old technology, which I learned very well they were by guessing several times wrong that people weren't using things that they still were using. But I think the point actually was for us to think about how communication technologies build upon each other. How we think that technologies go dead, and when in fact we take up some of the things of those technologies to keep reusing and reinventing over and over again. I think the point was to tell us that if we aim to be good scholars of communication and good scholars of new media, this didn't excuse a really deep commitment to dealing with history. We couldn't talk about literacy without talking about orality. We couldn't talk about the printing press without talking about the pen. We couldn't talk about the internet without talking about trains. For me, it meant that I couldn't talk about and seriously attend to Black digital culture without sustained attention to Black oral culture, to Black folks' relationship with technology that began long before social media. So important for this talk, it means that I can't start talking, if I'm going to talk about the blogosphere of the early 2000s, it's because it's going to set up for us conditions under which I get to then talk about things like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. So throughout the book, I take up these different approaches to studying discourse and technology, at times privileging rhetorical criticism, media studies, political economy, and critical technocultural discourse analysis. I'm teaching a grad seminar right now on critical methods in digital and media studies. And just about every week, the graduate students land on the same question. What is the difference between these methods? What makes them actually applicable in one case and not another? Why should I be doing one and not something else? And the answer that we frequently land on is that we are trained in different departments that had different trajectories, and we get to name our stuff what we feel like naming it. But the answer also is that those different methods and different departments and different disciplines also signal different assumptions that we all make about texts by themselves. So here are my assumptions, and here are the assumptions I bring to this study. I don't believe that it's possible or fruitful to disentangle rhetorical arguments of communicators from the technologies that they're using. I believe users are interpolated with the technologies that they deploy, that things change the users, and those users then change the things in ways that we must find a mechanism to study. I also think that the long history of a people is really important in understanding how they take up and deploy both rhetorical arguments and digital tools. For Black women, this long history means that we must consider how we've been written out of our collective knowledge about what constitutes technological expertise, and that this was not accidental or happenstance. Rather, it was part of an intentional process of erasure. To centralize Black women and Black feminism in a discussion about technology, I take lessons from critical archival studies. Tanya Sutherland defines archival amnesty as American archivists' neglect in documenting violence against a marginalized group that has real and lasting implications for restorative and transitional justice. So archival amnesty is a mechanism we can use to critique bias and absences in the contemporary historical record that do not serve a master narrative. Lynching, for example, an all too common part of American life, but accounts of these terrorist actions against Black Americans are frequently absent from the archive. Sutherland explains that this erasure does further violence to Black Americans now by removing any accountability from the perpetrators and the state who are complicit in these crimes. This is particularly relevant for a lot of the court cases that are happening across our screens right now on CNN and MSNBC and any other news network you may choose to watch. This erasure harms Black Americans, but it also changes a core part of US history. Florini takes this up in her essay about memory and suggests that in US culture, we historicize events in order to depoliticize them, and that works in order to produce consensus. As she says, thus, controversial and contradictory accounts of the past are often erased or marginalized in the service of historicizing racism, relegating it to the past and therefore facilitating a contemporary disavowal of its existence. But Black women were core users and creators of technology during the antebellum period in the US, yet remain largely absent in our written record. The master narrative doesn't grant space to Black women's words or document Black women's creativity in changing and growing the possibilities for our technologies. And historians can point to many plausible reasons why white women and Black women in men's history is harder to find in the archive. But I still argue that not collecting these records is a part of this process of archival amnesty. The absence of Black women in our understanding of technology is an intentional practice that does further violence to an already oft violated group. Excluding Black women from our history of technology furthers our now sedimented idea that white men are ultimately most responsible for technological innovation. So in this talk, I take up the task of at least a small portion of that rewriting process by focusing on Black feminist technoculture in the space of the blogosphere. Blogging was made popular in the early 2000s when we had the addition of free platforms like Blogger, which meant that users could create and publish content without needing any coding skills. Communication and internet scholars rightly turned their attention to the value those blogs brought to things like political discourse and consumer culture. Axel Bruns takes this up and outlines how bloggers shifted users into creators and changed the very concept of production and consumption in a digital age. Blogs indeed offered us this new power to manage content, to index our news and information, to form communities of like-minded readers with similar experiences. They also offered a way to monetize writing online and other skills. So blogging provides us a unique space for the creation and maintenance of alternate rhetorical spheres for Black Americans specifically. But research on Black Twitter has highlighted that this platform, instead of blogging, is actually more used for retorts and hashtags and as a means of signifying and playing the dozens. Black Twitter is a really popular site for people to examine what Black folks do online, right? And it's a very popular site broadly to examine what folks do online. The work of scholars like Andre Brock or Sarah Florini, Meredith Clark have been groundbreaking in a lot of ways by pointing our attention to things like signifying practices and resistance and activism, even ratchet digital practice online. And that increased attention has allowed us to engage in a much more nuanced conversation about Black technoculture. But the over-focus on Twitter reflects, I would say, some researcher bias toward the platform. One of those reasons is that Twitter is a really accessible app to mine for data. It's a text-based app, and because of Twitter's APIs available, researchers can use things like hashtags and key terms. We can pull countless tweets. Computational software can run sentiment analysis. We can do network analysis. We can do coding on millions of tweets at a time, right? Researchers and journalists, though, I think also focus heavy attention on Twitter because we use it. Right? It's the place where we're required to engage in this practice of self-promotion and distribution of our work. And so a lot of our scholarly attention tends to focus back on that app. Recently, we've gotten more cross-platform analysis. Sarah Florini's work on oscillating publics brings that in quite a bit. But overall, I would argue that social media apps trace their origin to the blogosphere. Jill Walker-Retberg makes this claim as well, that blogs were social media before the term was even coined, right? Blogs form the backbone of what we now consider to be social media. As she puts it, far more people could be on Facebook or other social media platform than there are currently bloggers, but much of what we do in social media is at its root form a type of blogging. But most of that research on blogging was happening in the very early 2000s, before folks discovered Black Twitter, and before Pew put out its very consequential 2010 report that showed that Black users were over-indexing on social media. So internet inquiry just missed this whole decade of really rich discourse about the Black blogosphere. In this talk, then, I'm going to talk about Black feminist thinkers through long-form writing, how Black feminist thinkers build community, engage in digital archiving practices, and ultimately begin to craft foundational principles for Black feminist rhetoric online that we now see on sites like Twitter or on Instagram. Blogging was the landscape where we could work through those principles in dialogue that was protected from outside interference. This is not like Twitter, as we know, where groups often seek that kind of engagement with other publics, either to foster community or to engage in activities like resistance through protest and boycotts. Bloggers instead formed these alternate communities to refashion things outside the gaze of the dominant group. So while folks were posting recommendations for natural hair care products or discussing Beyonce or watching Scandal each week, Black feminist bloggers were advocating for emancipatory freedom too, reconceptualized liberation within a digital framework. And the principles that were formed by Black feminist thinkers in the blogosphere not only were just articulated online, I argue they exist because of Black feminist relationship to that digital culture. So from this study, which comes out of one of the chapters of the book, I chart 5 principles that bloggers use to make rhetorical arguments for Black feminism. They are as follows. The first is the prioritization of agency. The second is the right to self-identify, and I'll come back to these. Sorry, I don't have slides. The third is centralizing non-binary spaces for discussions about gender. The fourth is a formation of complicated allegiances. And the fifth is the insertion of a dialectic of self and community interests. I want to be clear, though, when I say and use the word principles, I don't mean that I'm trying to trace people's beliefs. Instead, my approach here and my method point me toward understanding how people deploy arguments in a space about Black feminist thought and how the space where they develop those arguments and deploy them helps shape the arguments themselves. So let's start with agency. To talk about agency in the book, I zero in on one blog. It's called A Belle in Brooklyn and was founded by a writer named Demetria Lucas. Lucas was a relationship expert and had this relationship and lifestyle blog in the early 2000s, often writing her advice through the lens of popular culture. Something happened, with Beyonce, and she would write something that translated to how we should think about our own relationships. It was similar to what folks were doing in early gossip blogs at that time, before gossip blogging kind of took a different turn. In December of 2014, Lucas penned an article that was called 6 Things I Care About on Beyonce, the self-titled album, more than her feminism. For context, what was happening at that time is Beyonce had put a big sign behind her that had the word feminist on it. And lots of folks were having a discussion about whether or not we could actually call Beyonce a feminist. Lucas has this list, though, that suggests, I don't care whether Beyonce calls herself a feminist. There's more important things to talk about than that. But this is really clever wordplay because, in fact, she's talking deeply about Beyonce's feminism through this list. In fact, she's highlighting things like the individual agency that Beyonce possesses and being unwilling to let other people define or label what is problematic or patriarchal or what could be considered feminist or progressive in her work. She's treating Beyonce as 2 things, a character in her videos and songs and a business person who's making decisions. And she's highlighting how the agency of both of these figures, the character Beyonce and the figurehead who owns this character of Beyonce, are both functioning in a system where agency is of primary importance. The character Beyonce, she locates in talking about sexual agency, how in her videos that are attached to this album, sexual pleasure is the most crucial component of Beyonce the character's encounters. She is sexual, but not sexualized. Her agency creates possibilities for the former and challenges the latter. People can sexualize the image of Beyonce if they choose to, but for digital Black feminists like Lucas, her agency supersedes all of these concerns. Lucas then turns her attention to the business figure of Beyonce, who she's also defending for her financial and economic agency as an artist. What we have to be clear about here, though, is Lucas is doing this within a context where she is in charge of her blog that supports her own livelihood. She is making the case that Beyonce is determining herself and her agency as an entrepreneur and someone who produces feminist content, whilst she is doing that with the text that she's writing herself. Lucas's status as an entrepreneur whose blogging contributes to her financial well-being, she argues, doesn't negate the work that her blog might also be valuable to people in some kind of altruistic sense. She's refusing to separate the possibilities that the work that Black feminists do that earns them money, that brings them attention, can't also be to the good of tearing down capitalistic patriarchy. So she is using Beyonce kind of as this figure to really have a conversation, I would argue, about herself and about what bloggers are able to do in this space and how they're pulling on these tensions around agency that have been present in Black feminist thought for a long time. Black women, unsurprisingly, have long been concerned with the capacity of agents to act, of people to act independently, right? So this isn't some new concept in Black feminist thought. But for traditional Black feminist thought, the wall that we bump into is capitalism, right? Because agency can only go so far within a capitalistic sense without getting taken over and without it becoming about the individual rather than the collective. This isn't the case, though, for digital Black feminists who are deploying agency intentionally as an argument within this capitalistic sense. So the difference in how Black feminists online are conceptualizing agency is a product of their relationship with the digital tools that they're using to have these discussions. When Black feminists are taking up agency online, they're signaling their ability to master and adopt a strategy for liberation that is intentionally pulling at the most salient feature of American neoliberal culture, which is personal liberty and individualism. They're aware of it. They get it. It's just like what Black women were doing in the early 1900s with respectability politics, right? There's this notion that Black folks weren't aware of how respectability was damaging to Black women and Black communities. No, it's about using the language of the dominant class to strip them of exclusion from these systems of oppression that they are being pulled out of. In the case of respectability, Black women can't possibly be real women who exist in marriage and who have access to voting rights, right? With agency online for Black feminist thought, Black women aren't a part of technology. They don't understand this. They couldn't possibly be creators and content creators and providers in their own sense. So they're embracing agency to work against the racist logic that supports Black women's exclusion from the mythology of digital technology. Agency is about redefining the self as a powerful and skillful player within a system of technology and digital culture. So now, rather than being trapped by the gaze or controlling images or over-sexualizing Black female bodies, digital Black feminists are suggesting that they control their bodies and they control their images online. And that in and of itself is transformative and transgressive, no matter who's watching. These things are provoked by seemingly opposite beliefs about women and freedom, respectability and agency, right? But they're both strategies that folks are taking up. Both are trafficking in ideologies upheld by capitalism, and both are upheld within these racial projects, a la Omi and Winat, of liberalism. But we shouldn't conclude from their deployment within this capitalistic system that either group of thinkers is unaware of how dominant hegemonic ideology works to cause harm with relationship to respectability and agency. I think it's unclear as yet whether this strategy is long-term effective, but it's something that we should be paying attention to as folks continue to take it up. So I'll move on to the second rhetorical argument that's used, and that's the right to self-identify. Digital Black feminists are recognizing that there are power and implications in self-naming and claiming it as a right that's previously been withheld to them. Not surprisingly, in this era, Black feminist bloggers are relying very heavily on named participation in their blogs. So avatars, screen names, pictures, about pages to create familiarity among readers. And we might imagine this is universally true. Of course, everyone has avatars and screenshots and all these things, but this is also the era of anonymous posting, right? So early 2000s, right? Every blog is not intent on you naming yourself and putting your picture out there. But when the Black blogosphere began to explode, Black feminist bloggers were taking their cues from sites like MySpace and Black Planet, which had existed long before, where users were required to identify themselves. This is something that by now we've all had practice in. We log in, we create an avatar, we select a changing handle or username, sometimes to comically mock this, what's going on in the world today. Everyone who comes of age in or is of age in the digital era has practiced this online performance of self. But for Black women who are considered deviant and other in American society, the performance of self has extra layers and complexities to it. Patricia Hill Collins talks about how mediated images of Black women are often a tool of hegemonic control within a matrix of domination. Likewise, Kishana Gray's work on video game culture describes how Black video gamers face racist provocations as players while navigating gaming communities, whilst possessing deviant other statuses and identities. So the vitriol that is faced by Black deviant gamers occurs because others form perceptions of them offline and then bring those perceptions of them offline to online spaces. Digital Black feminists have encountered this kind of ideological weaponry that I just described from Gray and Collins before they ever started blogging. Self-identification, therefore, becomes a political decision that one makes before you ever pick up a phone or a computer, where you must be intentionally resistant to the kind of othering that hegemonic whiteness practices daily. Because of the vitriol for offline identities, digital Black feminist blogging practices establish this principle of the right to self-identify, asserting that they alone have the power to name themselves as feminists, as Black, and as women. All right, let's move on to the third principle. The third rhetorical strategy here is a deployment of a language that moves beyond binaries. I think that digital Black feminists, far more than their feminist foremothers, find comfort outside of gender binaries. And this comfort, I argue, comes in some part from socialization online, which trains us to see our work and our identities and our lives outside of binary. The digital requires us to break our common notions of binaries like public and private, like work and play, like virtual and real. Blogging and other writing that happens online is profoundly personal, but at the same time constructed in spaces where everyone might have access to it. When we draft ideas and threads and memes on Twitter, It's a part of the branding that we need to do to sustain our employment, but it's also, as Brock calls, libidinal and non-productive and inefficient. It's both those things at the same time. Our online communities are often labeled virtual, yet we have closer relationships with people we've never met than we do with our neighbors or coworkers that we know in real life. So bloggers' embrace of online writing is updating our narrow definitions of labor and play and community and publicity and privacy. If you come to feminism at a time where you must consistently sit comfortably outside of binary boxes, that makes for a really particular moment where Black feminism is ready to contend with the reality of gender as both confining and as liberating. So the Black feminist blogosphere is creating these spaces for discourse outside of the binaries of gender. Both Black trans and cis bloggers have already pushed those boundaries in their digital work. And while the Black community, just like every other part of society, has to grapple with instances of transphobia, I'm arguing that digital Black feminists are really carving out a principle that demands that all Black people have the right to exist as themselves. This is nowhere more evident than in the blogging of the recently deceased and parted blogger, Monica Roberts, who writes, what is it about the simple demand of trans people wanting to peacefully live our lives just like anyone else on the planet that scares the crap out of people? Is it because it forces cis people who are uncomfortable in their own skin to think about gender identity characteristics that people once thought were immutable? Or is it because trans people make cis folks realize that the dividing line between masculine and feminine is not the rigid Berlin Wall binary many people envision it to be, but a thin line segment that we all fall somewhere along? All trans people around the world want is to proudly live our lives in various nations, just like any other person. So this principle of gender non-binary acceptance and advocacy represents a generational shift based on digital sensibilities. Black cis writers do not always get this right in the blogosphere, but fortunately, they're still creating these allegiances and alliances with trans writers in the blogosphere as well. And these allegiances shift Black feminist politics in the direction of being better equipped to fight for the freedom of all Black folks. So let's talk about allegiances then as the next and fourth principle of digital Black feminism. I trace allegiances and complicated allegiances for digital Black feminists in two different ways. But I do this by the only time in the book where I do a sustained study of Black men. And so we talk about how Black men and white women, for example, serve important roles in how Black women develop strategies that highlight what I call the temporal practicality of infirm alliances. And I look at that by thinking about Very Smart Brothers as a blog. Very Smart Brothers is a blog that was started, I want to say in 2008, I should know this offhand. It was started, I think, in 2008 by Damon Young and Panama Jackson. So I've been studying this blog for a long time. And these are two of my favorite writers. They initially started this blog as a lifestyle and humor and relationship blog. It's really developed in kind of a cultural centerpiece now where they write about politics and race and gender. But what's really fascinating about the site Very Smart Brothers is how much attention they pay to developing a coherent, cohesive community structure where people really deeply engaged with them as writers and they deeply engaged back with their readers constantly. I mean, I've never seen actually a blogging community that was this tight, where folks are still getting together 13 years later in real life, right, offline, are volunteering to help each other move, are seeing each other as family. And this was a really tight space for about 10 years there. What happened was, and what happens as things happen is that this blog site grew and it got more popular. And the writing of Young and Jackson got more popular and they got acquired by Gizmodo Group and became a subsidiary of The Root. So instead of that enclave's insularity, the discourse on VSB shifted to more of what we would call a counterpublic, right? Where writers were now aware that their readers were not just other Black folks. The comment section was managed by Gizmodo, which meant that all of those tight relationships that were formed based on the avatars and names that people had chosen back in 2008 all had to change. New names, new pictures, new identifiers, right? And this seems like a small shift on the surface, but this carefully crafted community really changed. Long before that move, I would have labeled VSBs as a very progressive site. Posts contained interrogations of patriarchy and misogyny, particularly as they related to the Black community. And while Young and Jackson have never named VSBs as a Black feminist site, the arguments produced by both of these men and the other writers that they employ regularly feature Black feminist rhetoric. So digital Black feminism creates complicated allegiances between Black men and Black women, right? Where a blog that is titled Very Smart Brothers can be a conduit for enclaved Black feminist discourse. Black women didn't create VSBs, it's not run by Black women, but it doesn't make it devoid of Black feminist rhetorical practice. Not all the content on the blog is widely feminist, though. To be clear, many posts never deal with gender, and some deal with it in ways that we would regard as highly not very feminist. Nevertheless, I think a principle of digital Black feminism is a willingness to form these complicated allegiances, finding accomplices in a struggle for liberation without the necessity of a purity test. Ultimately, digital Black feminists are building these allegiances online with Black men who are interested in unsettling patriarchy, even when they still struggle with their own investment in it. But VSBs gives us a second opportunity to think about complicated allegiances as it relates to Black feminist relationship with corporate media. So within that early blogosphere, most bloggers were hosting their own sites, eventually drawing big enough readership that they could solicit advertising. As I talk about in a later part of the book, blogging, though, started to allow Black feminists to brand themselves and their content in ways that allowed for larger streams of income. For those who rose in popularity, this meant partnering with large media sites like Gizmodo and selling content to other publishing venues. Within these arrangements, as we see with VSBs, there's a trade-off. For VSBs, their audience gets much bigger. More people are paying attention to their work. They too received opportunities to have their writing showcased at a national stage. Two articles that come to mind are one that Damon Young wrote in 2017 called Straight Black Men Are the White People of Black People, and one that Panama Jackson wrote about what he called How Trump Ruined My Relationship with My White Mother. These articles spread far and wide and brought a whole new segment of readers back to a VSB site that used to be a very tight enclave space for communal discourse. So with this extension into a broader audience, they lost the enclave that they so meticulously built and traded it for an opportunity to thrive in a counter-public space. But unlike enclaves, counter-publics utilize different rhetorical strategies to reclaim space in a public sphere and host intergroup dialogue instead of intra-group dialogue. So the two formed this very complicated relationship with a media company, recognizing that the benefit maybe outweighed what they thought they were losing in that period. They could no longer control the dialogue that was going to happen once they put their material out there. But digital Black feminism is deeply practical in this sense and much less focused on this litmus test for participation. So people are using the spaces they have and the people they have relationships and the digital tools they have to advance the causes they care about, even on platforms that may not belong to them. They acquired this practicality, to be clear, from their feminist foremothers, who also leaned into the revolutionary pragmatism of complicated allegiances. Okay, let's conclude with the final strategy here. The last strategy is one that I say causes a reckoning for the future of Black activism, for digital activism, and for digital Black activism. The long history of Black activist work in various movements for Black nationalism, civil rights, the movement for Black lives, all tell us a really interesting story about women. I think that history teaches us that even as Black women do the work of social movements, the fight for Black folks' rights traditionally focuses on Black men. So Black feminist activists and scholars have always worked in these movements, always done a lot of the work that has been ignored, co-opted, and further maligned. And despite the sexism that has been rampant in many sections and factions of the civil rights movement, Black women continuously contribute to this struggle, using their platforms often to advocate for the rights of Black men. If you think of back all the way to anti-lynching campaigns that were led by Black feminist activists like Ida B. Wells, using her writing to advocate primarily for Black men, hoping that Black women would gain residual benefit from that piece. In doing this work, other folks also co-opted the labor of Black women. Treva Lindsay writes about this with the anti-rape activists in the 1970s who used Black women's strategies from the 1800s to make their claim. Or the Me Too movement of 2017, which initially overlooked the work of Tarana Burke. Black trans women like Marsha P. Johnson are often left out of the history of queer activism by mainstream gay and lesbian organizations. Even in the current movement to defund the police, Lindsay insists that to recenter the lives and labor of Black women, girls, and femmes in our current debate about defund the police isn't just about recognition, it's about ensuring that we don't render us as no one. So Black feminists have always recognized the need for a strategy that would prioritize a dialectic of self and community interests as a defense mechanism against this tendency we have as a society to place Black women's physical and emotional needs on the back burner. But I think the cues for this formal argument happening on social media are born in the blogosphere. I point us, for example, toward the case of Melissa Harris Perry, a scholar who began her public writing career as a blogger, writing for The Root and other online sources before getting her show on MSNBC. When she left that show in 2016 or was forced out, she released a public letter about this force on a blog where she said, "I will not be used as a tool for their purposes. I am not a token, a mammy, a little brown bobblehead. I'm not owned by NBC executives or MSNBC. I love our show. I want it back." She condemned the network openly at that time for what appeared to be an intentional demographic shift in hosts during the 2016 election cycle that really excluded Black journalists. We kind of have to search back in our mind, right? But when Barack Obama became president, MSNBC all of a sudden had a lot of Black folks that were suddenly equipped to talk about politics that they'd never known before. But when he was no longer going to be president, again, MSNBC made some decisions about who was no longer capable of talking about politics in regular roundtable political discussions. Harris Perry made clear that she was not accusing her former employee of intentionally trying to harm her because of her race. Instead, I think we should read her accusations about tokenism as a broader indictment of the industry that uses Black faces on the screen as a salve without more carefully interrogating the racism and misogyny of political coverage and political news more broadly. But in sending that letter and in leaving the network, Harris Perry was carefully navigating a balance between her own career interest and labor and the impact that her departure would have on the Black community, who no longer had her as someone regularly on the air on MSNBC. The arguments that she's drawing on and fighting for her show are replicative of the kind of dialect of self and community interest that digital Black feminists deployed as a strategy for years in the blogosphere. We can now see this strategy that has been taken up in places like Twitter with the Say Her Name hashtag, or on TikTok, where Black women were effectively tried to strike, refusing to make up new dances last year that would inevitably be appropriated and taken from them without credit. This hashtag, the dance strike, they're outgrowths of the same argument about self and community interest having to be in conversation, not neglecting one for the other. So as the movement for Black lives centers on cases like Ahmaud Arbery or George Floyd in the summer of 2020, what we saw with digital Black feminists was a push to extend rights to trans women, to gender non-binary folks, refusing to take a back seat and insisting that names like Breonna Taylor's not be ignored, and that Black men no longer be complicit in ignoring Black women's suffering and pain. Digital Black feminists continue to organize and try to seek reciprocity for their constant support of Black men in the movement for Black lives, drawing upon these complicated allegiances in their politics and demanding agency over their own bodies. So digital culture compels Black women to pursue, I think, this dialectic of self and community interest, and provides a platform where we can sit with the complexity of what those choices look like. A dialectic of self and community interest is a principle that builds on all the other four that I just talked about. Black feminists craft each of these principles that I've outlined here in the blogosphere. So blogging serves as a medium to distribute the new principles, right? But the relationship that Black feminists formed with blogging has shifted those principles as well. The relationship is back and forth. So while these principles of agency, complicated allegiances, self-care, they've been a part of feminist discourse for a long time, digital culture really provides us a new urgency and priority to attending to them. And the blogosphere, I argue, provided a really unique environment for Black feminist bloggers to work out these ideas, to cultivate community, and to create safe harbor. So as we all move on to studying the newest platform and the newest kinds of ideas of what's going on in social media, algorithms, discursive practices, I insist that we continue to point back to the blogosphere as a place to help us better understand the context for what we're seeing today.